Lecture 4, Part 2 now. We got to actually fight the revolution. So we've declared independence. That part was relatively easy compared to what's going to happen next. The U.S. Army, the Continental Army, they call it, actually has to fight the greatest military power on Earth. The British Army and Navy was really unmatched. And Britain viewed the colonists as traitors and obviously promised to crush this rebellion. And on the surface, any comparison between the two sides seems like Britain is totally overpowered, overfavored. It's got a large, extremely well-trained army. They were able to supplement their professional army by hiring mercenaries from the German states, the famous Hessian soldiers. They had the world's most powerful navy. They had experienced military commanders, many of whom had fought the battles of the 7 Years' War in North America, so they had a little bit of familiarity. Whereas the colonists had local militias that were very poorly trained. They were infamous for kind of running away as soon as people shot at them, which I can't blame them for that. The Continental Army, the official national army, was lucky if every soldier had a working firearm. Washington himself, the commander of the Continental Army, he worried that the militias would end up dragging down the few professional troops that he had. He said that a proper military needed discipline, and the militias especially were too used to what he called unbounded freedom. Hell, the militias elected their officers, which, I mean, if you've got any kind of military background, you know that you can't do that. But the militiamen say that they're fighting for freedom, and part of their right as free Americans is to choose their leaders, and they insist that that includes being able to elect their officers, which Washington thought was absolutely bonkers, and sometimes didn't work out, but sometimes it did. But not every colonist wanted to rebel. At the start of the war, about 20% of Americans were solidly loyal to Great Britain. They don't think Britain's perfect. They think there's room for improvement. Most of them had taken part in the protests and the boycotts leading up to violence. They're just not willing to take that next step. They're not willing to talk about independence yet. And about another third of the colonists really didn't care that much. If we get independent, okay. If we don't, okay. As long as it doesn't really interfere with their lives, they're not that bothered by it. On the other hand, the colonists have some advantages. They're fighting on their own soil. They're fighting on land that they know better than anyone else. And they're often fighting close to their homes, which gives them like that extra incentive to defend. They're fighting for a cause that inspires devotion and sacrifice, whereas the British Army is fighting to force other people to stay British. And a lot of Brits back in England itself really didn't think it was worth the fight. I mean, if they want to go, let them go, who cares? So it became, as the war goes on, increasingly difficult for the British Army to get volunteers. Although, to be fair, when the war is going badly for the U.S., Washington has a lot of trouble getting recruits too. But over the 8 years of the Revolution, from 75 to 83, about 200,000 men served. Washington's Continental Army was entirely volunteer. But each of the 13 individual colonies, I guess individual states now, required their able-bodied men to serve in the state militia for a period of time, unless that man could provide a substitute. And as the war goes on, more and more young men of the upper class will choose to send someone else in their place. And so the Continental Army became increasingly made up of young men who didn't have a lot of prospects. They're the landless sons of farmers, they're indentured servants, they're laborers, they're slaves who have been promised freedom in exchange for their service. Today, being a daughter of the American Revolution or a son of the American Revolution it's sort of assumed to be kind of an upper class thing. But at the actual time of the revolution, most of the soldiers were not members of the elite. They were the good old boys of this era, white and black and some native, fighting for a cause. And they suffered dearly for that cause. Of the free male population, 5% of the men between the ages of 16 and 45 died in the revolution. Like today, if we lost 5% of our men between 16 and 45, that would be 3 million dudes. So it's a huge, 5% doesn't sound that big, but it really is when we're talking about the loss of life. But as long as the colonists maintain some kind of army in the field, as long as they can keep fighting, the idea of independence stayed alive, no matter how much the colonists seemed to be losing battles. And certainly in the first few years, we lost a lot of them. And despite the power of the British Army and just the empire in general, conquering the colonies would be a really enormous and expensive task. And it's not one that the public back home was all that enthusiastic about. They were certainly not thrilled about paying the taxes that would go to fund this war. They still haven't paid off the debt from the last war. The tax rate in Britain itself is becoming kind of intolerable, and now there's another one. And the British military over here made a series of missteps. When the war started, about 20% of the colonists were hardcore loyalists, and another significant percentage were totally unconcerned about independence. And the British could have used that to their advantage. But instead, they alienated even those colonists who had started out supporting them. Like they would plunder homes and they would attack people without always asking what side they were on. And everywhere that kind of thing happened, more and more colonists became, like by default, revolutionary supporters. But most notably, from the very beginning, British commanders misjudged the degree of support for independence and the abilities of the American citizen soldier. British General Thomas Gage, he's the guy whose soldiers fought at Lexington and Concord. He said that he and the other British officers were surprised by the spirit of the Continental troops. And in his words, that has led many into great mistakes. Plus, the British have a lot of rivals. They've just finished a war with France, right? So the French are perched on the edge of their seats, waiting for the British to fail. And the Spanish are kind of the same way. So if the colonists can just manage to prove themselves a little bit, they might get help from those other empires. And with that help, might have enough to push the British back. And if the British commander, Sir William Howe in the north, if he had prosecuted the war more vigorously at the beginning, if he'd really put everything into it, he probably could have nipped this rebellion in the bud, just destroyed Washington's army, and called it a day. In fact, the British won almost all, actually, of the early battles. But while Howe won a lot, and Washington lost a lot, Washington lost well. There is a good way to lose, and a bad way to lose. If you lose the good way, you give up territory, but you keep most of your troops alive and free. And that's what Washington was able to do. He tried to avoid a lot of direct confrontation with the British, so his army would pick around at the edges of the British troops, and then they would retreat as soon as the Brits started to gain the upper hand. They would give up that territory to keep more men alive so they can fight again the next day. And that sort of war of attrition, right? That picking at the British until hopefully they just give up is what Washington's trying to do. Now Howe, who's in charge of British troops in the north, he attacked New York City in the summer of '76. Washington moved his army to Brooklyn, which at the time was a completely separate city, to defend. And Howe pushed Washington back, almost cut off his retreat across the East River, but Washington managed to escape to Manhattan and then into New Jersey. And his men continued to fight. Howe did chase after them, but he was never able to inflict a decisive defeat. But the continuing losses, even though the losses weren't large, that frustrated a lot of colonial troops, and some of them just went home. Washington's army in the summer of 76 had about 19,000 men. By early December, he's only got 5,000 left, and the vast majority of those are just deserters. They're not dead, they're not captured, they're not injured, they're just frustrated and they gave up and went home. So to restore morale and to get the army back up on the horse, Washington launched a couple of surprise attacks on the weakest part of the British side. That's the German mercenaries. He launched the first surprise attack at Trenton, New Jersey. This picture shows him crossing the frozen Delaware to get to the Hessian troops in Trenton. They attacked on December 26th, 1776. So the day after Christmas. Half the Hessians are passed out drunk. The ones that are awake are so hungover, and Washington attacks at dawn. Shortly before they made the crossing of the Delaware, Washington ordered his officers to read out loud an essay by Thomas Paine, the guy who wrote Common Sense. This essay was called The American Crisis. And Paine wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." So essentially, if you're still with Washington and you're going to get your butt on this frozen boat to cross this icy river and attack a whole bunch of people who are better armed than you, then you're badass. And everybody else can go suck eggs. It was a surprise, not just because it took place at dawn, but because traditionally you don't fight during the winter. The powder gets wet and it doesn't fire. Men tend to be low on supplies during the winter. Soldiers tend to get sicker during the winter. So traditionally what you would do is you just hunker down. And for most of the winters during the Revolution, that's what Washington will do as well. They will find a place, they will hunker down and wait for spring. But this time, he's really desperate. He's got to have some kind of decisive victory. So he does this completely off-the-wall, untraditional thing. And in fact, General Howe was so outraged at Washington's breach of tradition that he wrote him an angry letter. "You are no gentleman, sir." Plus a lot of other nasty stuff. Because what Washington's doing is just not, it's not proper warfare. But it worked. They smashed the heck out of those Hessians. And then 2 days after New Year's, they did the same thing at Princeton, New Jersey. So now Washington's had a couple victories. He's getting some of his troops to return back to the Continental Army. He's building it back up. In the summer of 77, he gets a stroke of luck. Summer of 77. We've got General Howe on the British side in New York. We've got General Burgoyne on the British side up in Canada. And Burgoyne has come up with this plan. It's a three-pronged plan that he thinks will crush the Continental Army and totally end the Revolution. He is going to march his men from Canada south. In New York, Howe is supposed to march his men north. And from the Great Lakes, another British officer named Salinger, along with some Mohawk troops, led by Joseph Brant, who was a Mohawk war leader, they're going to come in from the west, from the Great Lakes, and all three of these British armies are going to converge, defeat Washington's army with their overwhelming numerical strength, and then they'll be able to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. And remember, a lot of the loudest voices for independence were coming from Massachusetts, right? In New England. They want to get rid of the Adams cousins, and they want to get rid of Hancock, and they want to get rid of all of these guys who are New England natives. And they think that would be like cutting the head off the snake, right? And then the rest of the colonies will just give up. But Burgoyne has a problem. Howe also has a plan. Howe doesn't know about Burgoyne's plan, and Burgoyne doesn't know about Howe's plan. So Howe starts marching towards Philadelphia, which is entirely the wrong direction. Burgoyne is marching south according to his plan. Salinger and Brant are coming in from the Great Lakes. That part's going according to plan, but that third leg has fallen off because Howe doesn't know that he's supposed to be meeting up with Burgoyne. Nobody told him. That Great Lakes leg is also going to cause a problem. Brant, the Mohawk leader, and Salinger are going to run into some other members of the Iroquois Confederacy. When the revolution begins, it has a tremendous effect on Native people. Everyone has to choose a side. And a lot of nations will try as hard as they can to be neutral. They will see it as not their fight. But eventually, everyone's going to be affected by this. And the Iroquois Confederacy is going to split. The Oneida and the Tuscarora are going to join on the colonists' side. The Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Seneca, and Cayuga, they're going to join on the British side. I mean, that makes sense. I mean, any look at both sides, it seems really obvious that the British are going to win. So they're choosing the side that they think is going to bring them the victory. And up to this point, both sides of the Iroquois Confederacy have worked very hard, even though they disagree over which side they support in this revolution, they worked very hard to not fight each other. We've not yet had a battle where Iroquois is fighting Iroquois, but that changes here. Salinger and Brant attempt to take Fort Stanwix, which is a Patriot-held fort, and the Patriots send in the Oneida to try and reinforce the fort. So now we have Mohawk and Oneida, and actually some Seneca, fighting each other at the Battle of Oriskany. And this is, for the next 50 years, the Iroquois Confederacy will be effectively non-functional because of this. And this is the first time since the 1300s that the Iroquois Confederacy has broken apart. And from Burgoyne's perspective, that's the second leg of his plan. So now there's only one leg left, but he still doesn't know it. He doesn't know that Howe isn't marching north, and he doesn't know that Salinger and Brant have been stopped. So he's still marching south. And here comes Horatio Gates, he's subordinate to Washington. He's one of the commanders of the Continental Army. Gates finds out that Burgoyne is going to hit a place called Saratoga, New York. So in the middle of the night, Gates has his troops surround this 1/3 of the British Army there. And when Burgoyne wakes up the next morning, he does not have reinforcements. He's just surrounded by Continental troops and a few state militias. And so after a short battle, Burgoyne surrenders. Now that victory at Saratoga, was a massive boost to Patriot morale. And it also was a boost to those countries who were waiting to see if we might win. The Battle of Saratoga helped to persuade the French and the Moroccans that America might actually win this war. It's not a surprise attack. It's a more or less traditional set-piece battle. And the Patriots won that. So now France is like, okay, we're going to send you some help. American diplomats, led by Ben Franklin, drew up a treaty with the French in 78. France recognized the U.S. as an independent nation. They agreed to provide military assistance. And from time to time, there will be more French soldiers fighting alongside Washington than there are Continental troops fighting with him. Now, the French want to help weaken Britain and maybe get back some of their lost territory. Soon after this, Spain also got involved. They won't technically be allies of the U.S., and they won't give us a lot of material help, but they will distract the British by attacking British outposts in the West Indies, and that will draw British attention away from the Revolution. So, 1778, the U.S. now has allies. We've won some surprise attacks. We won a traditional kind of battle, and the British are like, we're going to change our focus. We're going to focus more on the South now. In the southern colonies, the British knew that there were a lot of social tensions, especially between small farmers on the frontier and then the big wealthy planters, and they want to exploit those tensions. They also knew that a large number of Southerners were loyalists who would support the British Army. And they also the British thought that they could disrupt the Southern economy by urging slaves to escape, which will absolutely work. In December of 78, British forces took Savannah, Georgia. In May of 1780, British General Clinton captured Charleston, and with it 5,000 American troops. The year 1780 was arguably the lowest point of the Revolution from the Patriot perspective. Congress is essentially bankrupt. The Continental Army went months without being paid. The British were very successful at playing up those conflicts between different groups of colonists, and thousands of Southern loyalists joined up with British forces. 14 regiments from Savannah alone joined the British. Tens of thousands of slaves fled to British lines. The men were promised freedom for themselves and their families if they would fight in the British Army. In August, British General Cornwallis just routed an American army at Camden, South Carolina. A rout is not a retreat. A retreat suggests good strategic military order. A rout is just absolute bloody chaos, and that's what happened at Camden. In September of 1780, Benedict Arnold, one of Washington's most capable commanders, defected to the British side and almost succeeded in handing them the fort at West Point. He was thwarted because Washington made a surprise visit and Arnold had to escape. 1780 was just a bad year. 81 really didn't start any better. Soldiers are frustrated by the losses in the South and by the lack of pay, by the lack of supplies. 1,500 Pennsylvania soldiers mutinied and marched on the Continental Congress. And the Congress promised that the soldiers could either be discharged and go home, or they could re-enlist for more money. Money which the Congress does not have, but they promised it anyway. The British have all of these advantages, but just like in the North, they're not quite pushing it the way that they could have. Now, British commanders held a number of southern cities, but whenever they ventured outside the cities, Patriot militias would harass them. In South Carolina, American troops were commanded by Francis Marion. He's called the Swamp Fox because his men would come like boiling up out of the swamps when the British troops are on the road, when they're trying to move from town to town. So Francis Marion's dudes would just come up out of the swamps, they would hit really fast, and then they would just disappear back into the swamps. Because they're all swamp dudes. They know where it's safe to go, and the regular troops don't know. A bloody civil war engulfed North Carolina and South Carolina with Patriot versus Loyalist militias fighting each other and plundering each other's farms. In January of 81, American forces finally got a little bit of a turnaround. We fought the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina. Cowpens was this really large sort of pasture area, large enough to hold several contingents of soldiers. Nathaniel Greene was the American commander at Cowpens. Most of the men serving under him are militiamen, so they're not trained particularly well. They do tend to run pretty quickly, but Greene figures out that he can use their bad reputation against them. British troops know when they're facing militiamen, they're probably going to win because the militias will run away. And so Greene says, okay, we're gonna set up this battle. All I need you to do is fire one shot. You fire one shot, you throw down your guns, you turn around, and you run. I want you to run. No one will get discharged. No one's going to get, court-martialed. I want you to turn tail and run. So the British will chase you. Because the layout of cowpens, this is a map of cowpens, and this area in the middle where it's got the Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, right there, that is a feature in the geography there that's called a swale. S-W-A-L-E. I'm not actually going to test you over how to spell that. A swale is a depression in the ground. It's a low spot in the ground, but it's a very large low spot. So you can see Greene has placed several contingents of riflemen inside this swale. Now, if you're standing where the British troops are there in red, you are looking across the cowpens, and it appears to be entirely flat. You don't know that this dip is there, and you can't see that there are riflemen stationed there. So the British troops, Greene conducts this series of strategic retreats. He will attack the British and then run away, and attack and run away, and the British think that they're chasing him. What he's actually doing is retreating to guide them to this spot where he knows he can get the upper hand. So he's got these riflemen stationed inside the swale, and he's got these guys, he's got cavalrymen on the side who are prepared to flank, and he's got his militias lined up. And the British see them, and the British fire, and the militias fire back, and then they run. And they turn around and they run back to that swale with the British hot on their heels, and as the British get to the edge, holy crap, there's about 1,000 riflemen inside. And the riflemen just tear them apart. And then the cavalry comes around and flanks them, and the British are caught in between. So Greene has this incredible victory here at Cowpens. Then Washington kind of takes that idea of strategic retreat. Washington is facing down General Cornwallis on the British side. And so Washington retreats down the Yorktown Peninsula. And Cornwallis is chasing him, and Washington's attacking and falling back and attacking and falling back. And Cornwallis is hot on his heels. And then Cornwallis ends up on this peninsula with Washington's troops on the outside. But Cornwallis isn't worried about that, because a peninsula is surrounded on 3 sides by water, and Britain's got the biggest navy in the world. So that's actually a good place, Cornwallis thinks, for him to be in. So he writes up to the British general in New York. It's not Howe anymore, this time it's Clinton. He writes to Clinton and says, we've got the rebels, we've got them in a good spot, we're about to attack, just need some more reinforcements and we can crush this whole thing. And Clinton doesn't send any reinforcements. So more Continentals show up, some French soldiers show up, and Cornwallis's letters to New York start getting a little bit more frantic. The French are here now, we could really use those reinforcements, we could use a little bit of support, but we can still definitely win this as long as you send me that support. And Clinton doesn't send it. He keeps promising that he will, but he doesn't actually do anything, because he's shacking up with the wife of one of his subordinate officers. So for 6 weeks, Cornwallis is writing these letters and getting increasingly worried, because now it's not just Washington's Continental Army. It's not just supplemental French troops. It's the militia from almost every colony, plus now the French Navy is surrounding the peninsula. So Cornwallis has to surrender at Yorktown. When he surrendered about 8,000 British troops. That is the largest British defeat in the Revolution. And when the news reached London, what little public support the war had left just evaporated, and peace negotiations began after Yorktown. Now, it'll take a couple more years before the peace treaty is signed, and there will be some more skirmishes between 81, when Yorktown happens, and 83, when the treaty officially takes effect. But essentially, the outcome of the war is decided here. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, was one of the greatest diplomatic achievements in U.S. history. The American ambassadors, Ben Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, got the British to recognize American independence. The U.S. became the Western Hemisphere's first independent nation since European encroachment began. They got control of all the land between Canada and Florida, east of the Mississippi River. They got U.S. rights to fish off the coast of Canada, which was essential for New England. They promised that loyalists would not be harmed and their property would be returned. We won't entirely keep that promise, but we'll keep it for some people. So effectively, the revolution is over. But no revolution is only a military revolution. There always has to be this social impact, or it's not a revolution, it's just another war. And for the US, the social component was really more important than just the state of being independent from Britain. The colonial America was already a society that had real democratic potential. Despite the fact that many of our men did not own property, it was still more widely distributed here than in any other country in Europe. There was no hereditary nobility. We did have established churches, but they tended to be less powerful than in Europe. But even with that potential, it took the war, the revolution, to transform the U.S. into a nation that would at least think about celebrating equality and opportunity. The revolution unleashed all sorts of political debates that enlarged the scope of freedom and challenged the power structure. When we rejected the king and the idea of hereditary power, a lot of Americans said, well, why don't we just reject that whole concept of privilege and patronage and hierarchy and status? Now, not everybody wanted to do that. The men who led the revolution were mostly members of the elite, and most of them are not willing to give up their status and their power. The lower classes will not completely rise up as a result of independence. But the idea of liberty and an equal claim to liberty became a rallying cry. It became a standard that people used to judge and challenge American institutions just like they had challenged British ones. When Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, when he made that very straightforward assertion that all men are created equal, it was a radical thing to say. And at the time he said it, no one in power really seemed to understand all of the implications of that, not even really Jefferson himself. It's almost like most colonial elites heard the words, all men are created equal, and thought, why yes, I am the equal of the British aristocracy. But the fact that all men included all men, the poor, the landless, the slave, that doesn't seem to have occurred to them at first. And we're still in a world where a well-ordered society was supposed to depend on people's obedience to authority. Subjects to their rulers, wives to their husbands, children to their parents, slaves to their owners. Inequality was still fundamental to the colonial social order. But the revolution was a revolt against the authorities. Now, American elites usually wanted that revolt to stop once they themselves had gotten their independence. But the people under them didn't always want to stop. Now, men and women were talking about freedom from all the old authorities. Thomas Paine wrote, "Whenever I use the word freedom or rights, I mean a perfect equality of them." So, with liberty and equality as their rallying cries, different groups of Americans began making demands. In political and social and religious life, Americans will challenge the old domination by the privileged few. Now, in the end, the revolution will not completely undo the obedience that wives owe to their husbands or that slaves owe to their owners. But if you were a free man, even if you were a poor free man, this democratization of freedom was dramatic. And that was most obvious in the challenges that people made to limitations on participation, on who could vote. All throughout the colonies, elections became these freewheeling debates on the fundamentals of government. People were debating universal male suffrage, the right of all men to vote. They were talking about religious toleration. Some of them were even talking about the abolition of slavery. And it's not just the educated elite talking about these things. It's craftsmen and small farmers and landless laborers. These men are starting to become a little bit of a force in politics. They're not going to rise to the top, but they are going to be able to nudge, I guess, the public debate in the direction that they want. In many of the colonies, which are now states, the militias were like schools of democracy. The state militias had mostly been made up of poorer, landless men, but while the war was going on, they were allowed, because they demanded, to elect their officers. And after the war, they demanded the right to vote for public officials too. And you can kind of see their point. If Washington caves and lets them elect their officers during wartime, then why wouldn't you trust them to elect peacetime civil officials? I mean, the stakes are so much lower now. The tradition that military service would be a way to claim citizenship and voting rights, that will become a long-standing tradition, really, a way for different groups to demand their rights, even into the 20th century. The really radical potential of the revolution was most obvious in Pennsylvania. In the other colonies, when the revolution started, the official leadership of those colonies had either entirely embraced independence or they had split into pro-independence and pro-British factions. But not in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, almost the entire pre-war elite opposed independence. They're afraid that if they break with Britain, it will lead to anarchy, it'll lead to attacks on their property, blah, blah, blah. But that created a power vacuum among the pro-independence Pennsylvanians. So if you support the revolution and you want to be independent, but there's literally nobody in your colonial government who's on your side, are you going to listen to your colonial government? Are they going to look like a legitimate government to you anymore? Probably not. So you're going to look somewhere else. You're going to put your faith in some other kind of power, not the official government of that colony. And so this opens the door for the rise of a new pro-independence power structure in Pennsylvania. And it's based mostly among the craftsmen and the lower class communities in Philadelphia. It was organized by the local militias, who, again, are not usually wealthy men. And it's kind of controlled through these committees of just regular dudes who are acting outside the law. Their leaders included Tom Paine, who's not super wealthy, Dr. Ben Rush, who, again, is not a part of the elite. These are guys of modest means. Before 76, they really wouldn't have had much of a political voice. And now that they can, they believe really strongly in democratic reform. And so these radicals are really fighting for equality. And they particularly said that having property requirements for voting was a threat to equality. They said that the people, all of the people, were the best guardians of their own liberty, and that every free man should be able to vote, should be able to hold office, even if he doesn't own a single acre. In June of 76, independence hasn't even been declared at this point. They start putting up these broadsides all over the city of Philadelphia warning the citizens to distrust those overgrown rich men who were trying to create divisions in society and essentially keep the poor down. So after the end of the Revolution, Pennsylvania writes a new state constitution. Every state has to do that. All of the 13 original colonies, their charters are gone, obviously, so their original form of government is gone. They've got to write brand new state constitutions. And Philadelphia's was really one of the more radical ones. It created a one-house legislature that was elected every single year by all tax-paying men over the age of 20. It abolished the old property qualifications. You don't have to own any land at all. It got rid of the office of governor because they said that one man should not have all of the power that traditionally goes to the governor. And they also required that every county have public schools with very low fees that most people would be able to pay. Their constitution also included freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and religious toleration. Like Pennsylvania, every state is going to have to go through this process, write a new constitution, and figure out what kind of government they want their state to have. Now, nearly all Americans, nearly all, agreed that their states should be republics. Classical republicanism, right? So, no king. The authority should be based on consent of the governed. But there are a lot of different ways to structure a republican government, and nobody really agreed on the best way. Pennsylvania's new constitution reflects this idea that the people have a single set of interests. And so a single legislature, one house in their legislature, would be enough to represent all of the people. In Massachusetts, they thought that was way, way too radical. John Adams wrote up this pamphlet kind of denouncing what Pennsylvania was doing and describing what he thought a good government for Massachusetts would be. He wanted to create what he called a balanced government that would reflect all of the different divisions in society. So according to John Adams, there needed to be multiple houses in the legislature. There should be one that just represents the upper class, and there should be one for everybody else. Adams also wanted a really powerful governor. He wanted a strong court system. Some states agreed with some of his ideas, but only Massachusetts would take it as far as Adams wanted. The governor issue was a sticking point for a lot of people. A lot of Americans, up to this point, the governors of most of the colonies were royally appointed governors. So that kind of left a bad taste in the mouths of a lot of colonists. And now that they don't have to have governors, there are a number of states who really don't want them. And even if they have them, they want them to be relatively weak. They prefer that most power rest in the legislature that hopefully a majority of men will be able to elect. At the issue of voting rights and who gets to vote, who gets to hold office, those are really contentious issues. More conservative patriots wanted to hold on to their old power, and they wanted to do that usually by keeping the same voting restrictions that had been in place under Great Britain. One old elite wrote that it was ridiculous to think that every silly clown and illiterate mechanic deserved a voice in government. John Adams, he had been seen as a radical in the name of independence. But once the war was over, he went back to being really fairly conservative. He believed that men who owned no property really didn't have judgment of their own and weren't capable of using political power in a responsible way. Adams is really afraid of destroying the old hierarchy, the ranks and the distinctions, because he was near the top of that hierarchy. But getting rid of that hierarchy, that is precisely what the radical side wants. Men like Thomas Paine, that's what they want to do. Most of these states write new constitutions that have kind of a balance of power between the radicals and the conservatives. The least democratization tended to happen in the southern states. Those are the states that had a very deferential political tradition, and that allowed the big landowners to keep a lot of control and not face much challenge. So in Virginia and in South Carolina, the new state constitutions kept the same property rules for voting, and also said that the people would not be allowed to elect the governor. The legislature would choose the governor. Maryland lowered the property qualifications for voting, but they raised it for holding office. So more men could vote, but your choices in who to vote for are really limited. You had to have assets worth 5,000 pounds sterling to be governor, and that was a fortune back then. The most democratic of the new constitutions pushed the idea that voting should not be a privilege, only for a few, and that voting was a right, an entitlement. But even those more democratic states usually wouldn't go quite as far as universal suffrage. Pennsylvania got rid of the property qualifications, but they did require tax paying. Vermont, which was not one of the original 13 colonies, it was carved out of New Hampshire, but Vermont was the only one to completely eliminate both landowning and tax paying. Overall, the revolution did lead to a pretty big expansion in the right of white men to vote. By the 1780s, most of the states allowed large majorities of their white male population to vote. Now, there are still improvements to be made, even for white men, and there will be another fight over voting rights in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, but we'll get to that later. Now, the Revolution's impact on American religion was just as remarkable as its impact on the vote. Both patriot leaders and just regular people believed that religious toleration should be part of the cause of freedom. Religious dissenters, which we talked about that in the second lecture, those are usually Protestants who are not part of the Church of England. These dissenters, for a long time, had used the idea of liberty to demand toleration for themselves. We saw some colonies already, like Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, when they were first founded, trying to make religious toleration the rule. But typically, before the Revolution, if a colony had any kind of freedom of worship or religious toleration, that had come out of practicality, not really out of a well-developed theory of religious freedom. The colonies that were most likely to have toleration laws were the colonies that had the most diverse populations. But if you go up to like New England, you go to Massachusetts, the only toleration law they have is the one that Parliament forced them to have. Most of the people there are Congregationalists still, because they're descendants of the old Puritans. And so just as a practical matter, they don't see a need to have any toleration law besides what they're required to have. Whereas Pennsylvania, which is getting people not just from the British Isles, but getting people from the Netherlands and the German states, heck, at this point they've got a couple of Russians, they, as a practical matter, do need toleration laws. Before the Revolution, most colonies supported particular churches, established churches, out of their tax money. And most colonies discriminated in voting and office holding against almost always Catholics, always Jews, and often against dissenting Protestants. I mean, on the eve of independence, Massachusetts was still throwing Baptists in jail if they didn't pay their taxes to support the Congregationalist church. The Revolution opens some things up. It weakens a little bit America's traditional anti-Catholicism. It doesn't get rid of the anti-Catholicism entirely, but it weakens it a little bit. During the Revolution, the U.S. formed an alliance with France, which was a Catholic nation. The Second Continental Congress had invited Quebec, which was French Catholic, to join us in our revolution. They refused to do that, but we invited them. And then, of course, we were friendly with Spain, which is also a Catholic nation. So when the revolution was over, people immediately started to question, whether we should open some things up. Should we allow the Church of England, we're no longer a part of the British Empire, so should we allow the Church of England to have the privileges that they used to have? In New England, should we allow the Congregationalist Church to have the privileges that they used to have? I mean, they had fewer privileges than the Church of England, but they did have some. In Virginia, a lot of the frontier farmers were Presbyterian, and so they demanded relief from being taxed to pay for the Church of England that they didn't go to. They said that part of their liberty was the right to exercise their own beliefs, and that meant not being taxed to pay for somebody else's church. This drive to separate church and state brought together some kind of unusual groups of people. You've got Catholics joining together with dissenting Protestants, with Baptists, with Presbyterians, with Quakers, because all of them together have been discriminated against. They want separation of church and state because historically the state had persecuted them. The new evangelical churches, they want separation of church and state for the same reason, and also because many of them are afraid that if their churches get involved in politics, that the churches would become corrupt. It's not just to free government from the church, but to free the church from political influence. Like Isaac Backus was a Baptist leader in the 1780s, and he wrote quite frequently to Jefferson, to James Madison, to men like this, men who are not Baptists, men who are deists instead, writing about his worries that his church will become, in one letter he said, infected by the corruption of politics. So he wants this wall of separation between church and state. So you've got the Catholics, you've got the dissenters, you've got the evangelicals, you've got the deists all involved, trying to build what Jefferson calls this wall of separation. Now, just because people said they wanted it doesn't mean it necessarily happened. 7 of the states wrote constitutions that included the right to free and uncoerced exercise of religion. But there are 14 states at this point, so that's only half of them that have these religious toleration laws. And even in those states, those toleration laws aren't always enforced. Every state, except for New York, kept the old laws that barred Jewish people from voting and holding office. 7 of the states limited office holding only to Protestants. Massachusetts' new constitution guaranteed freedom of individual worship, but they're still going to take your taxes to pay Congregationalist ministers. It took a big fight to make them stop that. It took until the 1830s. Catholics did okay, actually. Every colony granted them religious toleration, the freedom to worship as they see fit. In Virginia, Thomas Jefferson wrote a bill for establishing religious freedom. It took a lot of controversy and about 7 years to get it passed, but eventually it did. Jefferson's bill for religious toleration in Virginia said that God had created the human mind to be free. So it took away all religious requirements for voting, for holding office. It ended taxpayer support for churches, and it barred the state of Virginia from forcing people to go to any particular church. When Jefferson died, his will stipulated that he only wanted 3 of his many accomplishments to be listed on his tombstone. He wanted them to list that he had written the Declaration of Independence, that he had founded the University of Virginia, and that he had written this statute on religious toleration. There's something really big that he's leaving off that list, right? Because to him, religious toleration is more important than his 2 terms as president. A religious liberty became the model for a way to think about rights, thinking about them as private things that should be outside of government control. The government, in many states now, can no longer tell you what church you have to go to, can't fine you or punish you or whip you or banish you if you don't go to the one that they specifically want you to go to. The separation of church and state drew a really bright line between what is the public authority and what is your private realm. It also offered a justification to see the U.S. as this beacon of liberty. James Madison insisted that one reason to support the separation of church and state was to reinforce the principle that the United States would offer asylum to all the persecuted, regardless of nation or religion. But even as this move toward religious freedom created a space that would allow all kinds of churches to grow, this culture of individual private rights was seen as kind of a threat to church authority. One example of this was the Moravian Brethren. They are a Protestant church. They're one of the dissenting Protestant churches. So they do like that they're no longer being taxed to pay for the official church. They do like that they're getting religious toleration. But now you got people going around saying that everyone gets to make their own decisions. And they don't like that part so much. Traditionally, the elders of the Moravian church had a lot of authority over their young people. Like they would arrange marriages, they would decide who gets sent into different apprenticeships. So they would effectively control the course of their parishioners' lives. And now they find that their young people are saying, you can't do that. That's my right to choose. It's my right to choose who I'm going to marry. It's my right to choose what job I'm going to do. You know what? It's my right to choose if I'm going to go off and be a Quaker instead. And the Moravians are just, the elders are really not okay for this. They feel like this individual freedom is, one of them said, an opportunity for sin and a threat to their authority. Now, most American churches learned to adapt to all of these changes, learned to adapt to living through a time when everybody is asserting their private beliefs. And one of the results of this separation of church and state was that little churches, which had always had really severe restrictions on them, are now able to grow pretty much unimpeded. So, like Unitarian Universalists, they start to grow. Free Will Baptists, they start to grow. Even today, while we are still arguing over what the proper relationship between church and state should be, there are more than 1,300 religious denominations being practiced in the United States. And that's because we disestablished these churches and created an opportunity for different beliefs to take hold. The revolution also rewrote ideas of economic freedom. In colonial America, slavery had just been one part of sort of a broad spectrum of different kinds of unfree labor. But in the generation after independence, the halfway mark between slavery and freedom disappeared, at least for white men. We see a decline in indentured servitude. We see a decline in unpaid apprenticeships, and there's a lot of causes for that. Servants completed their contracts. Many servants and apprentices took advantage of the chaos of the revolution to run away, and so we see fewer of them and more wage workers. And all of this talk about freedom and equality contributed to those changes. The lack of freedom inherent in indentured servitude and in most of these apprenticeships increasingly came to be seen as just not compatible with Republican citizenship, with what we want the Republic of the United States to be. Ebenezer Fox was one of those apprentices who liberated himself. He later wrote that he and the other apprentices he worked with kept hearing their masters talk about liberty and talk about rights and talk about equality, but not apply it to the men underneath them. So they just decided to up and make themselves free, and they all went off to join the Continental Army. In 1784, just a year after the war ended, a group of respectable New York middle-class ladies boarded a ship full of indentured servants and set them all free, on the grounds that indentured servitude was contrary to liberty. By 1800, there were almost no white indentured servants left in the United States. Now that deepened the distinction between slavery and freedom. It also deepened the division between the northern economy, which increasingly is relying on free labor, and the southern economy, which is ever more dependent on slavery. Americans in the Revolutionary generation were kind of preoccupied with the social conditions of freedom, with what you needed as a foundation to really be free. Noah Webster, the guy who wrote the first American dictionary, he said that equality was the soul of a republic, and that real freedom had to be based on a relatively equal distribution of property. He said that equality was more important than freedom of the press, more important than trial by jury, more important than anything else. He said that equality was the foundation of all freedom. And if people are not seen as equal, there is no freedom. I mean, we can all probably think of an example where that's true. Like trial by jury. That's an awesome right, we all like that. But what if it's a black defendant and an all-white jury? That rarely turns out well. Even John Adams, he's gone back to being fairly conservative, doesn't really like the idea of full democracy. Even he hoped that every man would get a little bit of land for himself so that every man could be at the helm of his own ship, really an independent man. Now, at the far radical edge of the revolution, the Tom Paine, Ben Rush side of the radicals, you got people who believe that the government should limit how much wealth any person can build up so that nobody would really be able to run over the others. Now, most free Americans were solidly in the middle. Most free Americans believed that equality meant equal opportunity, not equal conditions. And many leaders believed that because the U.S. had so much land and had just gained so much more from England, and had a population that was used to some degree of liberty, they believed that equality and justice and liberty would just kind of happen. But Jefferson was one of those people who believed that if a man didn't have economic resources, that man wasn't really free. Jefferson talked a lot about wanting a small government, but he also believed that the government ought to build a framework for men to have that economic independence. He wanted to give 50 acres of land to every free adult, men and women, as a way to help them on their road to independence. But after the war, the economy is so wrecked. There's no way Congress can do that. To pay for the war, Congress had issued hundreds of millions of dollars in paper money, and every time they issued more, the value of each dollar decreased. The war also disrupted farming and trade, so the foundations of every colonial economy were a mess. And some American merchants had hoarded all of the goods that they could, hoping to sell them off at really inflated prices. So altogether, too much currency in the marketplace, disruption of farming and trade, price gouging, that produces massive inflation, which means that the purchasing power of each dollar drops. What you could buy for $1 or £1 sterling in 1775 might cost you 5 or 10 by 1783. And then with the economy so disrupted, many people didn't have a way to get more money. One letter written to a Philadelphia newspaper said that the people are growing restless and angry, and that hunger will break through stone walls. And during the war, there was actually a lot of breaking through stone walls. Just in the first 3 years of the war, there were more than 30 incidents where crowds confronted merchants who were accused of holding goods off the market or of price gouging. And often these crowds would seize like all of the food stocks and then sell them off at the old pre-war price, and sometimes beat the heck out of the merchants. In one incident, more than 100 Boston women accused a merchant of hoarding coffee. So they broke into his warehouse and they just carted off all of his goods. By 79, we still got like 3.5, 4 years left in the war. Inflation is out of control. In 1 month, prices in Philadelphia almost doubled. The Second Continental Congress is the only national kind of government that the U.S. has, and they don't really have the power to do much. They urged each of the states to set up wages so that they don't fall too low and fix prices so that they don't go too high. And some of the states would do that, but then the merchants would always scream about it. The governments, the Continental Congress and the state governments usually believed that the government ought to promote the public good. And if it came into conflict with one merchant's desire to build up obscene wealth by screwing everybody else, then that's his problem. But the merchants are really opposed to these laws, the minimum wage laws, the price-setting laws. They talk a lot about something called a free market. The merchants argued that the economic development of a country does not come from men protecting the common good. They said it comes from men acting out of self-interest. They claimed that the economy followed these unchanging natural laws, like the law that supply and demand will regulate the price of goods. And they're getting it from this book, Adam Smith's great treatise on economics, The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith was a British economist. He published this book in 1776, and it became immediately very famous in the American colonies, because a lot of what he is writing is a direct challenge to mercantilism. And he's challenging mercantilism in large part because it's causing so many problems with the colonies. Smith argued that Britain should get rid of its mercantilist laws. It needs to get rid of those regulations. He said that what he called the invisible hand of the market would direct the economy more effectively and more fairly than any government intervention. And the merchants love this, because this gives them a justification to say that they don't want the government poking around and telling them not to price gouge. And it's still in play, right? I mean, it's still being used as a justification for businessmen who don't want the government to tell them to make their factories safer, or put gas detectors in coal mines, or don't want the government stopping them from fracking our water because it's not right for tap water to be flammable. So we've got two different ideas of economic freedom going on here. A lot of the patriots, the vast majority, had envisioned an American nation that was free of the British trade regulations, that would be able to trade with all of the world. But many of them didn't anticipate a country that would have no regulations. They don't like the British ones, but many of them would be fine as long as they were homegrown American regulations. So we've got two competing concepts of economic freedom. We've got one that says the public good, community needs, that takes precedent. And then you've got the other side that says unregulated economic freedom is the best way. and we still haven't decided, right? I mean, it's been 200 plus years, and as a nation, we still haven't decided which side we're on, or if we're somewhere in the middle. I mean, we've got people all across the spectrum here. Now, not all Americans, not all people within the United States shared in the democratization of the Revolution. Loyalists, white people who were loyal to Britain, they suffered a loss of liberty. Many of the leading loyalists, the Tories, had supported the boycotts and the protests before the Revolution. They had just pulled back at the idea of independence and war. Loyalists included some of the most prominent Americans and also some of the most humble. Altogether, about 20% of American colonists started the Revolution being really hardcore loyal to Britain, and 20,000 loyalists fought on the British side. At some points in the war, there were more colonial loyalists fighting with the British than Washington had in his entire Continental Army. There were loyalists in every colony, but they tended to be most numerous in New York and Pennsylvania and kind of in the southern backcountry. Some of them were wealthy men, especially New York and Pennsylvania. A lot of the loyalists there are wealthy men. Their fortunes depend on keeping a good relationship with Great Britain. So they're lawyers, they're merchants, they're office holders, Anglican ministers, and many of them are afraid that if the colonists win, it'll just unleash anarchy and people will feel like they can rebel all over the place. The struggle for independence took tensions that already existed and made them worse. Like in the South, a lot of the loyalists tend to be poor, small farmers. So in North Carolina, a lot of their frontier farmers, a lot of the poor dudes, are Highland Scots, and they tend to be loyalist. Now, they're not loyalist because they love England, obviously. They're loyalists because they hate the elite of their colony, and the elite in North Carolina tend to be patriots. So the Highland Scots who are out on the frontier, they're afraid that if the patriot side wins, the elites in their colony will just use that as an excuse to crush them even more. Up in New York, it's kind of the opposite. The wealthy tend to be the loyalists. Robert Livingston, he was a large landowner in New York. He's an exception. Robert Livingston was a big farmer. He was also a signer to the Declaration of Independence. And when a British army approached his estate in 77, his tenants and his indentured servants rose up to help the British because they thought that the British would take this land away from him and give it to them, which did not work at all. The revolution, in some ways, was a civil war among Americans. And freedom of expression is often the first thing to go in wartime. And many Americans were denied basic rights in the name of freedom. Dr. Abner Beebe of Connecticut was very open in his support of the British. And a mob attacked his house and tarred him. Newspapers that were accused of being pro-British were suppressed, sometimes by crowds, sometimes by the new state governments. Pennsylvania rounded up a whole bunch of Quakers. Quakers in Pennsylvania got rounded up. Pennsylvania also arrested Mennonites and Moravians and seized their property because all three of those groups are pacifist faiths that refused to join the militia. Many states required residents to take oaths of allegiance to the new nation, and those who refused were not allowed to vote, and in some cases they were exiled. Loyalists had their land confiscated and sold to patriots, and most of the buyers were merchants, lawyers, big landowners, already wealthy dudes. But when the war was over, as many as 100,000 loyalists, including 20,000 former slaves, were either banished from the United States or left voluntarily. Most of them went to Britain, a large number to Canada, and then some to the West Indies. Black communities in Canada would become very important during the abolition era, helping people escape. Now, for white loyalists who stayed, in the United States. The hostility of the war disappeared pretty quickly. The Treaty of Paris promised to treat loyalists fairly and return their land. Most of the land never actually got returned. But the loyalty oaths and the beatings and the tarring, those ended pretty quickly. Now, the Indian nations that participated in the war were much less fortunate, even if they were on the winning side. You remember, colonists were supposed to stop moving west of the Appalachians after the proclamation of 1763, but some of them hadn't stopped. Indian leaders in the Ohio Valley, in the Great Lakes area, they had complained about these continued intrusions on their land, and it became, once again, a flashpoint of conflict between native people and settlers and land companies. And a lot of patriot leaders, including Washington and Jefferson and Patrick Henry, were deeply involved in trying to get that Indian land. Washington himself had gotten more than 60,000 acres in land vouchers for land in western Pennsylvania. He'd gotten it in kind of an unethical way. One of the ways of paying soldiers when the army ran out of actual money was to give them land vouchers. And then at the end of the war, those men were supposed to be able to take that land. So during the 7 Years' War, a whole bunch of Washington's men were paid in land vouchers, not with actual money. But then when the war is over, there's that proclamation and says, oops, we know that we paid you with this land, but now we're not going to let you actually have that land. So Washington had gone around to a bunch of his men and had bought up 60,000 acres worth of land vouchers at discount prices because the soldiers were glad to get any kind of value out of those vouchers. So now Washington wants that land, not necessarily for himself, but he wants to be able to claim that and then sell it. And a lot of patriot leaders were heavily invested in making sure that that Indian land was available. The various Indian nations that were east of the Mississippi were divided during the Revolution. Many of them tried to be neutral, but their people would break apart into pro-British, pro-revolutionary factions. Some of them, like the Stockbridge in Massachusetts, fought with the Revolution. They fought on the Patriot side. We talked about the Iroquois Confederacy. Most of them, 4 out of the 6 nations, sided with the British, but then 2 joined the colonists. Both groups of Iroquois had worked very hard to not have to fight each other, but then at Oriskany they did. The Revolution ended the peace that had been held within that confederacy since before Europeans ever arrived. In the South, younger Cherokee tended to support the British. They will keep fighting long after 1783. Older Cherokee leaders preferred neutrality, but if they had to pick a side, they would often pick the colonists. So we've got a split in the Cherokee Nation as well. One of Jefferson's complaints, one of his grievances that he listed in the Declaration, was that Britain had enlisted what he called savages to fight on its side. But in the Revolution, savagery was not confined to any particular side. Out in the Ohio country, the British encouraged their allies to burn farms and settlements, and patriot leaders ignored the traditional rules of warfare when it came to Indians. In South Carolina, patriot soldiers were told to cut up every Indian cornfield, burn every Indian town, and enslave all the captives. That wasn't how they dealt with white loyalists. Washington also sent troops against the Iroquois with similar orders: destroy their towns, take slaves. The commanding officer of that operation reported that he had burned 40 Iroquois towns, plowed under their gardens, and destroyed thousands of bushels of stockpiled food, and many Iroquois communities faced starvation. And what really bugged some of them was the fact that he had plowed under Oneida cornfields and had attacked Oneida towns. And that's one of the Iroquois tribes that were actually on Washington's side. There were Oneida men fighting in the Continental Army while their families are being attacked by a different part of the Continental Army. Because the guy who was in charge of this mission really didn't care which Iroquois tribe he was attacking. In the Ohio Valley, the fighting didn't really end until the late 1790s, even though the peace treaty was signed in 1783. And in the early 1780s, before the war was over, a group of colonial militiamen surrounded a praying Indian town. We talked about the praying Indians last time, right? In like lecture 2 or 3. They're Indians who have converted to some kind of Christianity. But there were 3 praying Indian villages in far western Pennsylvania. And these militia decided that because they were mostly members of the Delaware Nation, because they were Delaware, they were probably spies for the British. So they took the people from 2 of the towns and then combined them all into this one village called Nadwin, and bashed all of their heads in. And then, of course, there was a retaliation, and a counter-retaliation, and that went on for the next decade. Liberty for white patriots usually came alongside a loss of liberty for many Indians. To a lot of colonists, access to the land was one of their spoils of war. Jefferson had said that driving the Indians from the Ohio Valley was necessary. And settlers who had wanted to move west of the Appalachians and couldn't jumped on the chance to force out the Indians who lived there, even if they'd had nothing to do with the war, even if they'd sided with the colonists. Even while the war was going on, revolutionaries forced defeated factions of the Cherokee Nation to cede a great deal of their land. By the time peace arrived, the Shawnee had been driven from Ohio to west of the Mississippi and into what is now Missouri. Many New England nations had been forced to take refuge in western New York, western Pennsylvania. After the Revolution, the balance of power in eastern North America had shifted almost completely away from Indian nations and toward white Americans. Many of these nations had lost a powerful ally when France abandoned its northern territory after the 7 Years' War. Now those tribes who had sided with the British lost another ally. In the Treaty of Paris, the British abandoned their Indian allies, didn't mention them at all. The British agreed to give the U.S. power over the entire region, south of Canada and east of the Mississippi, but that land wasn't theirs to give. Remember, there were almost no white settlers west of the Appalachian Mountains at all. It would be like me giving one of you permission to colonize the moon. I don't own the moon, but at least there aren't any people on the moon to be disturbed when other folks start streaming over the mountains saying this is their land. To Indians, freedom meant defending their own independence and keeping possession of their land and keeping their traditions. And like any other person, they used the language of the Revolution to describe their needs. Like the Iroquois declared that they were a free people subject to no other nation. The Creek and the Choctaw sent petitions to the new Confederation Congress and denied that they had done anything to forfeit their natural rights. So they're using the language of classical liberalism. They're using this revolutionary rhetoric to try and remind white revolutionaries that they said they were fighting for natural rights. Those natural rights belong to all humans. The new state of Massachusetts started a guardianship system over the nations in its state. And those nations petitioned the Massachusetts legislature complaining about that, complaining about this infringement on their natural rights, because most of the nations in Massachusetts had sided with the Patriots. They're on the winning side of the war. If you're on the winning side of the war, you're not supposed to lose the right to self-government. They also pointed out that for those nations that had been on the British side, that were on the losing side of the war, they were the only part of the losing side that lost their ability to govern themselves. Britain was on the losing side. All they lost was territory. The US didn't take over Britain, and we didn't act as Britain's guardian, and we didn't dissolve Parliament and say, oh, you can't have your own government, we're going to do it now. But we did that to Indian nations, including the ones who had helped the United States win this war. There just didn't seem to be any place left for the native population in the United States after this war. All right, got a couple more slides to go through, but I think I'm going to stop this recording right now, and then that'll be the third part.